In a small, quiet town in Oklahoma, life had always moved at a slower pace. The streets were lined with old, well-kept houses, and families lived in tight-knit communities where everyone knew each other. Neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles, and children played outside, their laughter filling the air as they ran down the sidewalks, unafraid of the dangers that might be lurking. It was a place where people felt safe, where they could rely on their neighbors, and where it was easy to forget that anything dark could ever creep into their world. But as the days passed and the months turned into years, there was something festering quietly behind the closed doors of one family's home, something that would soon shatter the community's sense of security. The Miller family appeared to be just like any other family in the neighborhood. They were churchgoers, attending Sunday services without fail. They were involved in local activities, their names often found on the sign-up sheets for community events. Ethan Miller, the 12-year-old son, was a bright, energetic boy who loved sports and spent his days running around with his friends, playing games, and just enjoying his childhood. His smile was infectious, and anyone who came into contact with him couldn't help but feel uplifted by his youthful energy. He had everything a young boy could want: a family, friends, and a home filled with promise. But beneath the surface, things were far from perfect. Ethan lived with his mother, Laura, his stepfather, Greg, and his two younger siblings, Mia and Luke. To outsiders, the family appeared to be well-adjusted and happy, but behind closed doors, Ethan's life was filled with neglect and cruelty. His mother, while loving at times, had her own struggles. Emotionally distant and often preoccupied with her personal issues, she was unable to offer the attention or guidance that her son desperately needed. Greg, her partner, was a volatile figure. On the outside, he appeared to be a hard-working man, someone who could be relied upon by the community, but within the walls of their home, he was a different person entirely. Greg was abusive, not just physically, but emotionally as well, and his anger was unpredictable. Ethan, being the oldest, became the main target for Greg's frustration. He often took the brunt of Greg's outbursts, enduring harsh words, punishments, and a level of cruelty that no child should have to bear. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ethan's situation worsened. He began to withdraw from his friends and activities, spending more time alone in his room, trying to escape the turmoil of his home life. His mother was too distracted by her own issues to notice the changes in him. She wasn't unaware of the tension between Ethan and Greg, but she was too afraid to confront the growing problem. The dynamics in their home were a delicate balance of fear and submission. Greg's controlling nature left Ethan with few options for escape. His world had shrunk to the confines of his house, and within those walls, Ethan began to feel like a prisoner, a captive in the very place that should have been his sanctuary. The emotional toll of the abuse was evident in Ethan's behavior. He no longer had the carefree energy he once had. His friends noticed that he seemed different, more withdrawn and distant. His bright smile, once so infectious, was replaced with a look of exhaustion and defeat. He began to struggle in school, his grades slipping as his mind became consumed with the dark reality of his home life. His love for sports, which had once been a refuge, began to fade as well. The physical pain of the abuse, combined with the emotional trauma, made it impossible for him to focus on the things that had once brought him joy. No one in the community knew what was happening behind closed doors. Neighbors had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. Ethan's family was the kind of family people admired. They attended church, participated in community events, and seemed, on the surface, to have it all together. But the truth was much darker. The emotional and physical abuse that Ethan endured at the hands of his stepfather was something he couldn't escape. The isolation he felt only grew as time went on, and the more he retreated into himself, the harder it became for anyone to see the pain he was in. The tragedy was that, despite all the warning signs, no one stepped in to help. As the months passed, Ethan became more and more desperate. The toll of the abuse had left him feeling numb, as though he had no control over his life. He didn't know how to escape the torment he was living through every day. He had no one to turn to, no one who could help him. His cries for help were met with silence, and as he struggled with the overwhelming weight of his pain, he began to lose hope. The cruelty that had been inflicted on him for so long finally reached a breaking point, one that would ultimately lead to the most devastating and tragic outcome. It was on a cold evening in November. when Ethan had returned home from school, that the darkness that had been festering in their home finally erupted. The tension between Ethan and Greg had been building for days, and when Ethan accidentally spilled a drink while setting the table, it became the tipping point. Greg's temper flared, and the violence that had been simmering beneath the surface broke free. What followed was an unimaginable act of brutality, an act that would forever change the course of Ethan's life and leave the small town of Oklahoma reeling from the tragedy. In the quiet town, where life had always been simple and predictable, Ethan's death would be a wake-up call to the community. The horrors that took place behind closed doors would shatter the illusion of safety and force everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth of what had been happening in their midst. Ethan's death was not just the result of a single act of violence. It was the culmination of years of emotional and physical abuse, neglect, and a complete failure by those who should have protected him. His story, once filled with potential, was tragically cut short, and the reverberations of that loss would be felt for years to come. Ethan's stepfather, Greg, had always been a significant presence in his life, although it was never the type of relationship one might hope for between a father and his child. When Ethan was younger, Greg had seemed like a source of authority, a man who would provide structure and discipline in their household. But as the years passed, the once strong bond between them began to weaken, replaced by a growing sense of tension. Greg's authoritative figure, which once felt like protection, gradually turned into something oppressive and cruel. Ethan's biological father had never been a part of his life, and his mother, while loving in her own way, was often distracted by her own struggles. She tried to provide the best life she could for her children, but her focus was often consumed by personal issues that kept her from seeing the cracks forming in her family. Greg's dominance in the household grew as time went on. At first, his control seemed harmless, even necessary in some ways, as he took the role of the disciplinarian. But the lines between authority and control blurred as Greg's behavior became more unpredictable. What began as a seemingly protective presence quickly devolved into something far more sinister. He became erratic, unpredictable, and volatile. Ethan, who had once looked up to him, began to see his stepfather as someone to fear rather than someone to turn to for guidance or protection. Greg's temper, which had always simmered beneath the surface, began to boil over more frequently. His outbursts were no longer confined to just minor issues. Everything, from Ethan's behavior to small household problems, became an excuse for Greg's rage. As Greg's behavior worsened, Ethan found himself living in an environment where fear and tension dominated every aspect of his daily life. The emotional and psychological abuse started to escalate, with Greg belittling Ethan at every turn. His words were sharp and cutting, designed to break down Ethan's sense of self-worth. He called Ethan names, put him down, and made him feel small, constantly reminding him that he was worthless and incapable of living up to expectations. Ethan, once a bright and hopeful young boy, began to withdraw into himself. The light that had once shone in his eyes dimmed, replaced by fear and anxiety. He became increasingly isolated, avoiding conversations with his stepfather and even his mother, who seemed too preoccupied with her own issues to notice what was happening to her son. Despite the growing tension, Ethan's mother, Laura, was either unwilling or too afraid to confront the worsening situation. She could sense the strain in the house. The way Greg's mood shifts seemed to cause a ripple of discomfort throughout the family, but she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the full extent of the abuse. Laura was a woman struggling with her own personal battles, unable to recognize the signs of the trauma her son was enduring. She loved Ethan deeply, but the emotional weight of her own problems prevented her from seeing the full picture. She had been drawn into her own struggles, and when she did notice the change in Ethan's behavior, she dismissed it as typical teenage rebellion. She never imagined that the emotional scars running deep within Ethan's heart were a direct result of the abuse he was enduring at the hands of Greg. As the months passed, the atmosphere in the household became increasingly oppressive. Greg's outbursts became more frequent, and the cruelty he directed at Ethan escalated. It wasn't just the harsh words anymore. There were physical confrontations too, with Greg using his size and strength to intimidate Ethan. At first, it was small things, pushing, grabbing, or threatening, but soon the physical violence grew worse. The emotional scars that had already begun to fester now had a physical manifestation. Ethan, once a boy full of life and energy, had now become a shell of himself, too afraid to speak out or stand up for himself. His attempts to escape the constant fear only made matters worse, with Greg lashing out in even more terrifying ways. Ethan's mother, despite the nagging sense that something was terribly wrong, still couldn't bring herself to act. She loved Greg, in her own way, and in her mind, the thought of breaking up the family, of confronting the violence, was too much to bear. She believed that the family could somehow work things out, that things would get better if they just tried harder. But in reality, her avoidance only allowed the situation to grow more dangerous. Ethan's cries for help went unanswered, and as time passed, the relationship between him and his mother grew more strained. He felt increasingly abandoned, as though no one cared enough to protect him. Weeks before the tragedy struck, the abuse became even more horrifying. Greg's cruelty had taken on an intensity that Ethan could no longer ignore. The physical violence was paired with emotional manipulation, making Ethan feel as though he had no escape. The fear he felt each day was palpable, and it began to consume every part of him. He found himself unable to focus on school, losing interest in things he had once loved. The boy who had once been full of hope and promise now found himself lost in a dark and painful reality that seemed impossible to escape from. His world had become a prison, and the people who were supposed to protect him were the ones responsible for his suffering. Ethan's mental and emotional state deteriorated further, and the signs of distress became more apparent. He was withdrawn, sullen, and anxious. He started to avoid people, retreating into the corners of the house when Greg was around. When he did interact with his mother, his voice lacked the enthusiasm it once had, and his eyes were often vacant, as if he had already given up on hope. But no one, not even his mother, seemed to notice just how far Ethan had fallen. Greg's power over the family had grown unchecked, and his ability to instill fear in Ethan had reached its peak. The boy who had once been filled with promise and potential was now being crushed by the weight of his stepfather's abuse. The mounting abuse reached a boiling point, and Ethan was pushed to the brink. The neglect, the physical and emotional torment had broken him in ways that no one could have anticipated. The tragedy that was about to unfold had been a long time in the making, a series of failures by Greg, by Laura, and by the community to recognize the signs of a child in desperate need of help. Ethan, left to fend for himself in an increasingly hostile environment, had nowhere to turn. The horror of his daily life would ultimately lead to a tragedy that no one could have ever seen coming, and the consequences of the abuse would leave scars not just on Ethan, but on everyone who had failed to protect him. The night of the crime began like any other, with Ethan going through the familiar rhythms of his evening routine. He finished his schoolwork, played briefly with his younger siblings, and then joined the family for dinner. The table was set as usual, and the sounds of casual conversation filled the room. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary evening in an ordinary home, a typical night in the Miller household. But the illusion of normalcy was about to shatter, and the calmness of their home would soon be replaced by a nightmare none of them could have anticipated. In the other room, Ethan's stepfather Greg had been drinking. His presence in the house had always been a source of tension, but on this particular evening, the alcohol seemed to heighten his temper. Greg had always been quick to anger, and his volatile moods were something Ethan had learned to dread over the years. It wasn't unusual for Greg to lash out, but on this night, something in the air was different. The tension in the house grew thicker as the evening wore on, as if the weight of unspoken frustrations had been building up for far too long. Ethan could feel it, the heavy atmosphere that settled over the room like a storm cloud, ready to break. Ethan didn't know what triggered it. It could have been something small, a comment, a gesture, or perhaps it was the culmination of months of suppressed emotions. Whatever the cause, the argument between Greg and Ethan escalated quickly, like a spark igniting a fire. The words exchanged became more heated, the insults sharper, and the anger in Greg's voice grew louder with each passing moment. But this time, the confrontation didn't remain just a verbal altercation. It transformed into something far darker, far more sinister. The argument turned into a brutal and twisted form of punishment, and before Ethan could process what was happening, he was already in the middle of it. What began as an exchange of harsh words soon devolved into violence, and the situation spiraled out of control. This was not just a beating. This was something far more depraved. Greg had devised a cruel form of torture that he had carried out on Ethan in the past, a form of punishment that involved his greatest fear: insects. Ever since he was young, Ethan had been terrified of insects. The mere thought of them crawling on his skin sent shivers down his spine. It was a fear that had been ingrained in him for years, and Greg knew it all too well. Greg's cruelty knew no bounds, and tonight he would take that knowledge to an unimaginable extreme. Ethan was forcibly tied up, unable to move, his body vulnerable and helpless. Greg made sure that Ethan could do nothing but endure the torment that followed. He took insects, the very creatures that Ethan had feared for so long, and used them as a weapon of torment. He placed them on Ethan's skin, watching as they crawled over him, biting and stinging. The insects scurried across his arms, his chest, his legs, finding every bare spot of skin to infect. Ethan's body trembled, both from fear and the pain of the bites, but he was powerless to stop it. His mind raced as he tried to wriggle free, but the ropes that bound him kept him still, helpless to escape the nightmare that his stepfather had unleashed on him. The insects crawled deeper into his clothes, finding every exposed area, and the pain intensified with every moment that passed. For hours, Ethan endured this cruel torment. His screams echoed through the house, but no one came to help him. His mother, sitting in the other room, heard the cries but did nothing. She was too paralyzed by fear or too overwhelmed by the situation to intervene. The silence that followed his screams would be the last anyone ever heard from Ethan. His body, battered and broken, was left to endure the pain until eventually the torment stopped. But the damage had been done. Ethan had been pushed beyond his breaking point, and the toll of the physical and emotional abuse would haunt him for the rest of his life. The night of the crime came to a devastating end. Ethan, who had once been a bright, energetic young boy, was left lifeless on the floor. The brutality of the abuse and the cruelty of the insects that had been used against him would leave an indelible mark on his body and soul. But the real tragedy lay in the failure of those around him to protect him, to step in when it was clear that something was horribly wrong. His mother, too terrified to act, sat by and did nothing. She had heard his screams, but the fear of confronting Greg had paralyzed her. In the end, she allowed the horror to unfold without intervening, and as a result, Ethan paid the ultimate price. The aftermath of that night left a family shattered. The community, too, would never be the same. Ethan's life had been stolen in the most horrific way possible, and the blame for his death would lie not just with Greg, but with everyone who failed to protect him. The quiet town in Oklahoma, once so full of life and promise, was now tainted by the tragedy that had unfolded in one home. The silence that had followed Ethan's screams was deafening, and the haunting question remained: how many lives had been affected by the horrific events of that night? And how could something so monstrous happen in a place where everyone thought they were safe? Ethan's death would not be forgotten. It was a chilling reminder of the dangers of living in an environment where fear and violence controlled every moment. It was a wake-up call to the community, a reminder of the importance of standing up against abuse and protecting the vulnerable. But for those who knew and loved Ethan, there would be no closure. His life had been stolen too soon, and no amount of justice could ever bring him back. The following morning, Ethan's mother, Laura, woke up early, feeling an unfamiliar weight in her chest. The house was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by a stillness that seemed to cling to the walls. She tried to shake off the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but the events of the night before had left her restless. Her mind kept going back to the sounds she had heard, the screams of her son, echoing through the house as he had endured the unimaginable pain. But she had been too afraid to confront it, too paralyzed by her own fear of what Greg might do to her if she interfered. Now, with the quiet in the house almost suffocating, she felt the need to check on Ethan. Walking to his room, Laura's heart began to race, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, but there was no sound coming from Ethan's room, no rustling, no movement. The house had always been filled with noise, with the hum of life, but now there was an ominous calm that made her uneasy. When she reached his door, she hesitated, her hand on the doorknob for a moment longer than usual. She tried to push away the fear creeping up her spine, but as she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Ethan was lying motionless in his bed, his body unnaturally still. At first glance, it seemed like he was sleeping, but as she stepped closer, the horrifying truth became undeniable. His body was covered in marks, small red welts from the insects that had been used to torment him, deep bruises on his arms and legs from the beating he had received, and a series of cuts and abrasions that painted a grim picture of the violence he had endured. Laura's mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. Her son, the child she had loved and raised, was no longer the same boy. The boy who had once been so full of life, who had laughed and played, now lay in front of her, unrecognizable in his stillness. The silence in the room was overwhelming. Louder than any noise she had ever heard, a wave of nausea hit Laura as the reality of the situation sank in. Her son was dead. The truth crashed into her with the full force of a tidal wave, and she stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move or speak. Ethan's lifeless body told a tragic story, one of unimaginable suffering and terror. His face, once bright and full of promise, was now pale and lifeless. The fear that must have consumed him in his final moments gripped her heart. She had been too late, too paralyzed by her own inability to act, and now it was too late to undo the damage. As Laura stepped into the room, her mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Ethan had always been a bright and happy boy, despite the struggles at home. But the signs of abuse had been there, hidden beneath the surface, growing darker with each passing day. She had known about the tension between Greg and Ethan, had heard the arguments, but had always told herself that things would get better. She had hoped that the love she had for her son would be enough to pull him through the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The violence, the psychological torment, had broken him. And now, standing in the room where her son had taken his last breaths, she realized just how much she had failed him. The damage done to Ethan's body was unimaginable. The insects that had been used as a tool of torture had left visible marks all over his skin. His clothes were torn and disheveled, and his limbs were stiff, as though the violence he had endured had frozen him in place. The bruises were deep, purple and blue, covering his arms, his chest, and his legs, a testament to the brutality he had suffered. His face, once full of expression, was now lifeless, with bloodshot eyes that had seen more terror than a child should ever have to endure. The emotional and physical torment he had gone through was etched into every inch of his body, and the horror of it all hit Laura with the full force of a crushing weight. As she stood there, staring at her son's lifeless body, Laura's mind began to flood with thoughts of what could have been. She should have done more, she thought. She should have seen the signs, stepped in, stopped Greg before it was too late. But the truth was, she had been too scared, too trapped in her own fear to do anything. She had allowed her son to suffer in silence, and now it was too late to change anything. The guilt, the shame, overwhelmed her as she looked down at Ethan, the child she had promised to protect, now gone forever. The silence in the house was deafening. There were no more screams, no more arguments. All that was left was the aftermath of a nightmare that had unfolded right under her nose. The weight of her failure was suffocating. Laura had not just lost her son, she had lost herself in the process. The realization that she had been complicit in Ethan's suffering, that she had failed to protect him when he needed her most, would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the quiet of that room, surrounded by the terrible evidence of her son's suffering, Laura's world collapsed. The pain, the grief, and the overwhelming sense of loss filled every corner of the house. She was left with nothing but the aftermath of a horrific crime, the consequence of a series of choices she had made or failed to make. As she stood over her son, the reality of the situation finally settled in. Her son was gone, and nothing at all could ever bring him back. The silence that filled the room was the last sound she would ever hear before the world outside came crashing in. It wasn't long before the police were called to the Miller household. The neighbors had noticed that Ethan hadn't been outside for days, something that was entirely out of character for the energetic 12-year-old. He was a boy who had once been known for playing in the yard, riding his bike with friends, and always being involved in neighborhood activities. His sudden absence didn't go unnoticed. As the days passed and no one had seen or heard from him, the community grew increasingly concerned. The sounds that had once filled the house, the usual hum of a family going about their day, had been replaced by a tense silence. Something was wrong, and the neighbors could feel it. It didn't take long before one of them decided to check on Ethan, knocking at the front door, but receiving no answer. Worried, they finally contacted the authorities. When the police arrived at the house, they had no idea what they were about to uncover. They initially thought it might be a case of a missing child or a minor domestic issue, but as soon as they stepped inside the home, they realized the magnitude of what had taken place. The scene they encountered was disturbing beyond measure, and the evidence of what had happened to Ethan was immediately apparent. Ethan's lifeless body was found in his bedroom, and the horror didn't end there. The signs of prolonged abuse were undeniable. The physical injuries on Ethan's body, the bruises and cuts that were scattered across his skin, immediately told a story of violence that had been ongoing for a long time. But it wasn't just the marks of physical abuse that shocked the officers. It was the discovery of the insects. The police had never encountered such a cruel and calculated method of torture before. It was clear that the insects had been used as a deliberate tool of suffering, something that no child should ever have to endure. The crime scene was chilling, and the officers could barely process the full extent of what had happened in that room. Ethan's body was covered in welts, bites, and stings, evidence that insects had been used to torment him for hours, perhaps even days. His stepfather Greg was immediately arrested, the evidence against him too overwhelming to ignore. The authorities began questioning the family, trying to piece together the events that had led to such a horrific outcome. Greg was taken into custody, his initial response to the police questions defensive, but soon enough, the truth began to emerge. Ethan's mother, Laura, who had been complicit in the abuse by failing to act, was also arrested for child neglect. Although she claimed to have been unaware of the extent of the cruelty, the authorities could not ignore the fact that she had failed to protect her son, despite the signs of abuse that had been present for months. As the investigation unfolded, the community was left in complete disbelief. The town, which had once been peaceful and close-knit, was now shrouded in grief and shock. How could something like this happen in such an ordinary home? The Thompsons were a family who, to the outside world, seemed no different from anyone else in the neighborhood. They attended church together, participated in school events, and were involved in local activity. To the neighbors, they were just another family living out their quiet lives. No one could have ever imagined that beneath the surface, something so horrific was happening behind closed doors. As news of Ethan's death spread throughout the town, the questions began to flood in. How could the system have failed him so completely? How could the people who were supposed to care for him, protect him, allow such abuse to go unnoticed for so long? Why had no one stepped in sooner? The community, which had once been a place of trust and safety, now found itself reeling from the aftermath of this unimaginable crime. Parents in the neighborhood began to question their own relationships with their children, wondering if there were signs they had missed, if there was something they should have noticed. The tragedy of Ethan's death cast a long shadow over the entire town, and no one could escape the weight of the questions it raised. For Ethan's family, the pain was even more profound. His mother, Laura, was left to grapple with the realization that she had failed him when he needed her most. She had been blind to the abuse happening in her own home, too afraid to confront Greg and too overwhelmed by her own struggles to see the signs. As she faced the charges of neglect, she was forced to confront the truth of her inaction, something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Greg, meanwhile, was facing the full force of the law, charged with the abuse and murder of a child he was supposed to protect. The community struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could someone who was supposed to be a father figure commit such unspeakable acts against a child? The brutality of the crime left people speechless, and the horror of the insects used as a form of torture seemed too cruel to comprehend. In the weeks that followed, the town came together to mourn Ethan. Candlelight vigils were held, and neighbors shared memories of the bright, happy boy who had once been full of promise. The pain of his loss was felt deeply by everyone who had known him, but it was also a stark reminder of the importance of being vigilant, of speaking out when something isn't right. Ethan's death, senseless and tragic, forced the town to look at the darker sides of their own lives, to confront the reality that such horrors could happen right under their noses. The questions about what went wrong would linger in the hearts and minds of everyone involved for years to come. But for Ethan's family, the pain was unbearable. They would live with the knowledge that they had failed him in his most vulnerable moment. The guilt, the grief, and the unanswered questions would forever be their burden to carry. The case of Ethan Miller quickly made national headlines, sending shockwaves across the country. The horrific nature of his death, coupled with the disturbing details of the abuse he had endured, sparked widespread debates about child abuse, the dangers of neglect, and the devastating consequences of ignoring the signs of distress that children often try to express. The news outlets picked up on the story, and it became a focal point in discussions about how society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. The tragedy of Ethan's life and his untimely death was more than just a heartbreaking incident. It was a glaring reminder of the harsh realities faced by countless children living in abusive households, children whose cries for help often go unheard. It brought to the forefront the uncomfortable truth that many children are suffering in silence, unable to escape from the environments that should be their places of safety and love. As the details of Ethan's life unfolded through media coverage, the public was forced to reckon with the systemic failures that allowed such a tragedy to occur. Despite the outpouring of grief from the community, the question of how such cruelty could have been allowed to continue for so long remained unanswered. Ethan's death exposed the cracks in the system, the failure of not only his parents, but of neighbors, teachers, and friends who failed to intervene, who didn't see the warning signs, or who ignored them when they were staring them in the face. How could those closest to him not have seen the suffering that he was enduring behind closed doors? Why did no one act when it was clear that something was terribly wrong? These questions weighed heavily on everyone involved, and no one had the answers. The failure to protect Ethan became a symbol of a much larger issue: the failure of society to look out for its children, to notice when something is amiss, and to take action before it's too late. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Ethan's story was the role that social media played in it, or rather, the absence of it. In an age where children are more connected than ever before through social platforms, the lives of young people are often shared with the world, and sometimes the most intimate details are exposed to strangers online. Yet despite the prevalence of online presence, the true horrors of Ethan's life had remained hidden. No one could see behind the screens of social media to witness the pain he was enduring, to notice the signs of distress that he was carrying in his daily life. His online presence, if any, was likely filled with moments of normalcy, perhaps even masking the darkness that was unfolding in his home. Ethan's story raised troubling questions about the hidden lives children may be living, often overlooked by those who believe that things are fine simply because they don't see the evidence of abuse on their screens. How often do we overlook the silent suffering of children, believing that they are fine because their social media presence doesn't reflect the turmoil they face behind closed doors? The media, social activists, and child protection organizations used Ethan's tragic death as a catalyst to demand change. Public figures weighed in, with experts calling for better methods of detecting child abuse and urging communities to be more vigilant when it comes to the well-being of children. They highlighted how important it is to recognize the early warning signs of abuse: the bruises, the withdrawn behavior, the sudden changes in mood, and the silent cries for help that children often try to communicate in their own ways. Ethan's story served as a tragic reminder that vigilance is key in preventing such tragedies. It was a wake-up call for parents, teachers, neighbors, and friends to pay closer attention to the children in their lives, to ask the hard questions, and to act when they sense something is wrong. Ethan's death was not just a senseless act of violence, it was a failure on multiple levels. A failure of family, a failure of society, and a failure of the systems meant to protect children. His family, and his mother in particular, had failed him in the worst way possible. His stepfather Greg had subjected him to unimaginable horrors, and his mother had either been too afraid or too oblivious to step in and protect her son. And while the criminal justice system would hold Greg accountable for his role in the abuse, it was clear that there were deeper, systemic issues that had allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. The lack of intervention from those who should have stepped in to help Ethan was a glaring failure, and it left a deep, painful scar on the community that would never heal. For the people of Oklahoma, the memory of the young boy who lost his life in such horrific circumstances would haunt them forever. The town, once a place where families lived in peace, now carried the weight of Ethan's death as a constant reminder of the fragility of innocence. Ethan's story, though tragic, became a symbol of the need for greater awareness, better protection for children, and stronger systems to prevent such horrific events from happening in the first place. The community rallied together to mourn his loss, to offer condolences to his remaining family members, and to discuss how they could ensure that something like this would never happen again. Yet, despite the outpouring of grief and the demands for justice, it was clear that the damage had been done, and no amount of sorrow could undo the tragedy that had unfolded. Ethan's story became a touchstone for national conversations about child abuse, neglect, and the dangerous effects of ignoring the signs of distress in children. It also became a chilling reminder of how vulnerable children are in homes where they should be safe but instead face unimaginable terror and torment. The failure to protect Ethan was a reflection of the broader societal issues surrounding child welfare, and his death forced the public to confront these uncomfortable truths. His life, though tragically short, would continue to serve as a painful lesson about the importance of paying attention, of being present for children who may need help, and of doing everything in one's power to make sure that no other child has to endure the kind of pain that Ethan suffered. The questions raised by Ethan's story, how could this happen and how could we let it, remain unanswered, but his death has sparked the ongoing conversation that may one day lead to change. His story is a tragic reminder of what can happen when we turn a blind eye to the suffering of those who cannot protect themselves, and how the consequences of that neglect can echo through a community for generations to come.